the porch light across the street turned on, while I was locking the kitchen window for the night. I looked up without thinking much about it. The house beside ours had been empty since winter, except for the real estate signs that kept leaning sideways near the mailbox whenever the wind picked up. But that evening, movement passed behind the curtains. Someone carried a box through the hallway, while another man struggled with a floor lamp near the front door. I probably would have ignored it if the first man had not stepped closer to the window a second later. Even through the rain on the glass, I recognized him. Julian. For a moment, I stayed completely still, one hand resting against the cold metal lock above the sink. Behind me, the microwave beeped again. Nathan had asked me to warm his dinner almost an hour earlier, but he was still upstairs working. The pasta had gone cold by now anyway. Outside, the moving truck doors slammed shut. Rainwater reflected the streetlights across the pavement, while somebody laughed near the sidewalk. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Nathan sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by papers and charging cables. Still wearing the same wrinkled shirt he had left the house in that morning, his laptop balanced dangerously beside his knee while he typed something quickly without looking away from the screens. He apologized for missing dinner before I even said anything. Lately, he apologized the same way people comment on the weather, automatically. Without expecting a real response, I told him it was fine because arguing would have required energy neither of us seemed to have to anymore. While he kept working, I folded laundry at the end of the bed. A few minutes later, he asked whether we still had coffee for the morning. Then he asked the same question again before I could answer the first one. I watched him quietly after that. Work had not changed Nathan all at once. It happened gradually enough that I barely noticed it in the beginning. Longer hours, canceled dinners, half-finished conversations. Eventually, even when he sat beside me, part of his attention stayed somewhere else entirely. I almost told him Julian had moved in next door. The words reached the back of my throat twice before disappearing again. Nathan already looked exhausted, and suddenly the conversation felt too heavy for a Tuesday night. So I said nothing. That night, I slept badly. Around 2 a.m, headlights swept across the bedroom ceiling and pulled me awake again. I went downstairs for water and noticed a light still on in the house beside ours. Part of Julian's kitchen was visible from ours if the curtain stayed open. Boxes covered the counters beside a radio and several stacks of books. He moved slowly through the room unpacking dishes, stopping every so often to read labels or reorganize shelves that probably did not matter yet. The whole scene felt strangely familiar. There was a time when I knew his habits so well that I could tell what mood he was in from the way he washed coffee cups. I walked away from the window before he noticed me standing there. The next morning smelled like wet grass and burnt toast. Nathan rushed through breakfast while reading emails on his phone. He kissed my cheek distractedly near the doorway and left his untouched coffee beside the sink when he walked out. 10 minutes later, I realized the coffee machine was still running because neither of us had turned it off properly. That bothered me more than it should have. Not the coffee machine exactly. The feeling that our lives had become full of small unfinished things. People usually notice relationships breaking apart only after something dramatic happens. An affair, a terrible fight, someone finally leaving. But most of the damage happens quietly long before that, in missed conversations. In routines that slowly stop including each other, I cleaned the kitchen slowly just to give myself something to do. Around noon, I carried a trash bag outside and nearly stopped walking when I saw Julian standing beside his car. He noticed me at almost the same moment. Rainwater dripped steadily from the garage roof between the houses, while we looked at each other for a second longer than strangers normally would. Then he smiled. Not warmly, not cautiously either, just surprised. I walked closer before I could change my mind. He said he never expected to find me living there of all places. I told him I could say the same thing. The conversation stayed careful at first, both of us speaking the way people do when too much history exists beneath ordinary words. He looked older now, though calmer somehow, less restless than he used to be. I noticed the wedding ring when he reached into the back seat for another box. He noticed me noticing it. Then, almost casually, he explained that the marriage had ended the year before. No dramatic story, no bitterness. Just a quiet sentence before he changed the subject. I told him Nathan and I had lived there for 4 years now. Julian nodded slowly, like he was trying to imagine that version of my life and could not quite fit himself around it. A delivery truck turned into the street behind us, breaking the moment before either of us had to say anything more. Personal, we talked another minute about the neighborhood before I finally went back inside. The entire conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Still, I caught myself thinking about it while folding towels later that afternoon. Then again, while making dinner. That unsettled me. By evening, the rain had finally stopped. Cool air drifted through the kitchen window while I chopped vegetables at the counter. Around 7, Nathan texted to say he would be staying late again because something at work had gone wrong. I stared at the message for a while before setting the phone face down beside the sink. Then I ate dinner alone. Later, soft music drifted through the open window from next door. I recognized the song immediately because Julian used to play it during long drives when we were younger. Back then, he sang badly on purpose whenever he forgot the lyrics, mostly because he knew it annoyed me. Funny what the brain decides to keep. I closed the window harder than necessary. By the time Nathan came upstairs that night, he looked completely drained. He fell asleep on top of the blankets, with his glasses still on, and the laptop open beside him. Standing there in the dark bedroom, I suddenly felt less angry with him than I had earlier. He did not look careless. He looked tired in a way that made me wonder how long he had been struggling without admitting it. I covered him with the blanket carefully before turning off the lamp, but even after lying down beside him, sleep still refused to come easily. Because somewhere beyond the wall beside our house, a man I had once loved was unpacking his life, only a few steps away from mine. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. For the next days, you settled into a rhythm I did not entirely trust. Nathan left early every morning, carrying the same leather bag and unfinished exhaustion with him. Julian appeared outside at random hours, unpacking furniture, repairing things around the house, or standing on the porch with coffee while the neighborhood slowly woke up around him. And somewhere between those routines, I kept catching myself paying attention. Thursday evening, one of my grocery bags tore open halfway up the driveway, oranges rolled across the wet pavement, and a jar of pasta sauce tipped dangerously near the curb before somebody caught it first. By the time I looked up, Julian was already crouched beside the driveway, gathering the rest. I laughed out of embarrassment more than anything else, and apologized for carrying too much at once. Rain had started again, light enough to blur the streetlights without becoming a real storm. Yet, he carried 2 big Zephans to the porch before I could object. Inside, the kitchen looked exactly the way I would have preferred a stranger not see it. Laundry sat unfolded on one chair. Unopened mail covered half the counter, and one of Nathan's coffee mugs still rested near the stove from that morning. Julian set the groceries down carefully without commenting on any of it. Still, I became suddenly aware of the life around me, the routines, the unfinished tasks, the tiredness hanging quietly in every room. His eyes paused briefly on the framed wedding photograph near the refrigerator. Nathan and I looked impossibly young in it. We were laughing at something outside the frame, still close enough then that neither of us had learned how silence could slowly settle inside a marriage without anyone noticing immediately. Julian looked away first. He thanked me for the coffee I had not offered and stepped back toward the door before the moment could become uncomfortable. But after he left, the kitchen still felt different, somehow. That night, Nathan came home close to midnight. He looked distracted even while apologizing, pacing through the bedroom, searching for a charger that had been sitting beside him the entire time. I watched him check the same pockets twice, before finally noticing it near the lamp. Halfway through talking about a client presentation that had gone badly, he stopped suddenly and looked at me properly for the first time all evening. Then he asked if I had changed my shampoo. The question caught me off guard enough that I laughed. I told him yes. For a second, it almost felt like an old version of us again. Small observations, familiarity, attention. But then his phone rang from the bathroom counter, and whatever moment had almost appeared between us disappeared just as quickly. I lay awake longer than usual after he fell asleep. The difficult thing about loneliness is that it becomes easier to justify over time. People stop expecting to feel fully seen, so even small moments of attention begin carrying more emotional weight than they should. That realization unsettled me because I knew exactly where it could lead if I stopped being careful. Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of wood hitting concrete outside. Julian was repairing part of the fence between our yards that had loosened during the storm. Earlier that week, I carried coffee onto the patio mostly because the weather was cool and the kitchen suddenly felt too quiet. He looked up when the sliding door opened. For a while, we spoke casually across the broken fence while he worked. The conversation moved more easily than I wanted it to, helped by the strange familiarity that still existed between us despite the years apart. At one point, he asked if I still painted. I leaned back slightly against the patio railing after he said it. Nobody had mentioned painting to me in years. Not because it had been unimportant once, but because somewhere along the way, I had quietly stopped bringing it up myself. I told him I had not painted seriously in a long time, though my supplies were still boxed upstairs in the guest room closet. Julian smiled a little at that, he said. He still remembered the tiny apartment I rented before meeting Nathan. The smell of paint thinner near the windows, half-finished canvases stacked against the walls, because there was never enough space. Music playing too loudly while I worked late into the night. Hearing someone describe a version of myself I had almost forgotten felt unexpectedly painful, not romantic, just sad in a way I could not explain immediately, because the woman he remembered seemed more alive than the person I had become lately. That afternoon, Nathan surprised me by suggesting we go out for dinner. The invitation felt unfamiliar enough that I almost asked if something was wrong. For the first half hour, things actually felt easy between us again. We shared a bottle of wine. Nathan told me a long story about somebody at work accidentally deleting an entire project file, and for once he laughed without sounding distracted while doing it. At one point, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand absent-mindedly while talking. I realized then how badly I had missed simple things like that. Then his phone buzzed beside the plate. I watched the shift happen almost immediately. One email became two became 5 minutes of silence while he reread documents under the dim restaurant lighting. Eventually, he apologized without looking up fully. Already halfway lost, back inside work again, Nathan noticed me pulling away before the evening ended. When the waiter cleared our plates, he finally locked his phone and leaned back in his chair with a tired expression. Then he asked quietly if I was angry with him. The truth felt more complicated than anger. Sitting across from him like that, exhausted and trying in the only way he seemed to know how anymore, I suddenly felt guilty for every thought I had been having lately because Nathan was not careless. He was overwhelmed, and somehow that made the distance between us harder to explain, not easier. When we fell asleep almost immediately, I stayed downstairs cleaning the kitchen long after midnight just to avoid my own thoughts. While drying the last plate, I glanced automatically through the dark window above the sink. Julian stood outside on his back porch beneath the small yellow light near his door. A cigarette burned between his fingers, even though he had promised. Years ago, he would quit smoking. For a second, our eyes met across the quiet gardens between the houses. Neither of us waved, but neither of us looked away immediately either. By the middle of the following week, I started noticing small changes in myself that I did not like. I avoided standing too long at the kitchen sink because the window faced Julian's backyard. I kept the bedroom curtains closed more often. Sometimes I even waited a few extra seconds before checking the mail if I heard movement outside next door. None of it felt dramatic. That was the uncomfortable part. Most bad decisions do not begin with intention. They begin with small allowances people barely notice while making them. Nathan noticed my mood before I realized how obvious it had become. One evening, he looked up from his laptop and asked if something had happened at work. Because I had seemed distant lately, I almost answered honestly. Instead, I told him I was tired. That answer had become far too easy between us. A few days later, Nathan left for a conference in Chicago. He packed in a hurry, moving between the bedroom and bathroom while answering emails on speakerphone. At one point, he stopped beside me in the kitchen and apologized again for how distracted he had been recently. This time, he sounded sincere enough that it made me feel worse instead of better. After he left, the house became painfully quiet. Rain started sometime after sunset. I made tea, turned on the television for background noise, and spent most of the evening pretending to pay attention to a movie I would not have remembered. 10 minutes later, around 9:30, someone knocked softly at the front door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Julian stood outside holding a covered bowl, with steam escaping from beneath the lid. Rain darkened the shoulders of his jacket, and his hair looked damp from the walk across the yard. He said he had made too much soup, and remembered I used to like that recipe during winter. The familiarity of the sentence unsettled me immediately. I should have thanked him and ended the conversation there. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in while I found bowls in the kitchen. At the time, the decision felt harmless enough to explain away. That frightened me later. We sat at the counter eating soup while rain tapped softly against the windows. At first, we talked about ordinary things. A bookstore downtown that had recently closed. The traffic near the highway. How strange it felt getting older and realizing familiar places could disappear without warning. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward the years after our breakup. Not dramatically. Neither of us spoke like people reopening old wounds. It felt quieter than that, more honest. Julian admitted there had been months when he almost contacted me after moving away, but never knew whether hearing from him would make my life harder. I told him there were songs I still skipped automatically without thinking, because they reminded me too clearly of certain years. At one point, he laughed about an old road trip where we got lost for nearly 5 hours because he refused to ask for directions. I laughed too before realizing how long it had been since something felt that natural. The room slowly became too comfortable. That was the real danger. Loneliness changes people carefully. After enough time, attention begins feeling intimate. Familiarity begins feeling safe. And once that happens, people start crossing emotional lines long before they recognize what they are doing. At some point, Julian asked whether I was happy with Nathan. The question settled heavily between us. I looked down at my hands before answering, because suddenly I understood there was no harmless response anymore. Finally, I admitted I did not know. Saying it out loud made something inside me feel painfully real for the first time. Julian stayed quiet after that. Then he said relationships sometimes fade so slowly that people do not notice how unhappy they are until somebody else sees it. Immediately, part of me hated hearing that because part of me recognized the truth inside it. The silence between us changed after that conversation. Not awkward exactly. Just more aware. Julian carried the empty bowls toward the sink, and when he stepped back beside me, I could suddenly feel how close we were standing. Nothing happened. But for one brief moment, I understood how easily something could have, not because of passion, because of comfort. Because two lonely people had spent weeks circling around feelings neither wanted to name directly. I stepped back first. Julian noticed immediately. To his credit, he did not try to argue or turn the moment into something larger. He simply nodded once and apologized quietly for making things more complicated. A few minutes later, he left. I locked the front door behind him and stood alone in the hallway, listening to the rain for a long time. The house felt different now, as though some invisible boundary had almost disappeared completely. Upstairs, Nathan's side of the bed remained untouched. I sat there in the dark thinking about the past year of my life, about all the conversations Nathan and I never finished, about how easy it had become to avoid difficult truths by hiding inside routine instead. Somewhere in the middle of that silence, I realized I had spent months waiting for Nathan to notice my loneliness without fully admitting it myself first. Avoidance had damaged us as much as distance had. Nathan came home the following evening looking exhausted. His suitcase rolled unevenly across the hallway floor while he loosened his tie with one hand. But when he saw me still awake in the living room, something in his expression softened immediately. Before work could interrupt him again, I asked him to sit down, and this time, we finally talked honestly. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but honestly enough to matter. I told him I missed him even while living beside him. I told him our marriage had started feeling more like responsibility than connection. Nathan listened quietly through all of it, without checking his phone once. Then, after a long silence, he admitted he had felt himself disappearing too. People often think relationships end because of one terrible mistake. Sometimes they weaken through smaller things instead. Exhaustion, silence, the habit of assuming there will always be more time later to reconnect. That night we stayed awake until almost sunrise, talking through things we should have said months earlier. At some point, I noticed the porch light next door finally turn off. I looked at it for a second through the bedroom window. Then I closed the curtains and turned back toward my own life. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in Claire's place?